Welcome to this episode of Integrate or Die. I'm Steve Hunt.
And I'm Jordan Katz.
So today we talked to Mike Fitzsimmons, who is doing really interesting technology on something that it's almost amazing we don't have technology for it already, which is technology to one do reference checks, but better selection. But the really stuff we take in is technology to understand if companies are actually making good hires, to look at what happens after you've hired someone. And it's just fascinating. A couple of things that we took away. One, he said, is it's amazing what happens when companies actually start measuring whether or not they're making good hires, because it has all sorts of ripple effects on if they are or they aren't, how's this affected by where they hire from, how they hire, who's making the hiring decisions, how they're onboarded, how they're trained. Because you drop this data, it's almost like if somebody was playing sports and was never measuring whether or not they were hitting the goal or not. And suddenly, oh, look, we're measuring the goal. Then you learn all of this stuff backwards, which I just found absolutely fascinating. And the other thing that he talked about is right now there's so much AI driven staffing and all this stuff, and people can talk about bias. And he was saying, you can't know about bias if you don't actually measure the performance of people, because having an effective, unbiased hiring program isn't just about demographics, about are you actually making decisions on the things that lead to successful job performance. And you can't do that if you don't measure quality of hire after people are hired. This was one of these ones where I was like, Jordan, I was like, this is so obvious.
Right.
How is it we're not doing this? And so what were some of the things that you took away from this? Because I was just like, I just wanted to get up on the ground and stomp my feet like, wow.
Well, I definitely found it so interesting and hopeful, frankly, that it's a lot easier to get access to the data you need to actually execute on an analysis of the utility of your hiring process, or interviewing personas or whatever. Certainly much easier than it used to be when you and I were in selection science. And so that I find really hopeful, because the easier it is, hopefully the more likely are for companies to adopt an approach that says, here's the optimal profile of someone that we would like to hire for this role. And we didn't just make it up. We actually did some research to determine that actively drives performance, not just up to the 90 days when recruiters get paid or not, but throughout their first year and maybe second or third year of actual employment, right? And using historical data to create those types of models. The second thing reminded me to not be a blamer. You'll hear that in the interview for sure, but also to take accountability as an employee of an organization for taking action in the best direction you can, right? Don't just sit on your laurels or whatever, rest on your laurels, and we've done it all before this way, we're going to keep doing it. Think about how we can make things better, and oftentimes nowadays it's by accessing additional sources of data and running analyses that combine multiple variables. And then finally, um, you know, the idea that hiring managers and recruiters and others involved in the talent and recruiting arena have misaligned incentives, but also misaligned resources and training to do their job well. So we know that hiring managers who give interviews, their whole job isn't interviewing. And in fact, almost none of their job is interviewing, but they're asked to have this incredibly complex business interaction that they may or may not be good at. And so let's understand that, point of failure or success, and how do we strategize to increase the odds of that interaction being positive for both the interviewee and the interviewer.
Yeah, the last thing I need to talk about that too, Mike, is he said he's relatively new to HR technology. He's not new to technology, and I thought it was really
Yeah.
interesting too that he's like kind of shining this light on something that's showing his problem, and his feeling of I just hope people's behavior can change. It's what technology is. I thought that was just so
It's
fascinating. So
refreshing perspective.
it was absolutely. So let's go
Yeah.
listen to Mike. So hey, Mike, welcome to Integrate or Die. Thanks for appearing on the show. We always start this the same way, which is telling you why we wanted you on the show, and then you can tell us a little bit about why you think you're here. The reason that we wanted you on the show was, you and I had a conversation about the work that you're doing to build technology. One, to do kind of reference checking and making sure that people are who they say they are, that you're getting good quality of hires. But the other thing you're doing that I found particularly fascinating, because it's always been something that people have almost given up on, which is trying to assess whether or not you've made a good hire. assessing quality of hire and the value of having that data. There's so many different ways that we'll get into, but using it. But I love that you're like a great example of a person building technology to solve very specific but very critical problems. So that's kind of how we think of you. But how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I think you did a great job, and it is it's as a relative newbie into the HR tech space, if you will. I've made my career as a CEO and entrepreneur running companies outside of HR tech. Um, it's been fascinating to kind of quickly get smart about the challenges that we face. And one of the things, just to give you a little bit more context into how I got into this, was one of my prior companies that I built to 500 employees and 200 million of revenue, and made a couple of incredibly regrettable hires towards the end of that journey that we never fully recovered from. And I said to myself, first, is this just me? And then I started looking around, and the data shows that 45% of new hires don't ever get ROI profitable for the company that made the hire. And then I said, okay, it's not just me. And then I said, hey, can we go fix this? Right. So that's my context on why the heck I'm here, and why I'm now 5 years into trying to help sort of solve this problem. And at the end of the day, the problem is, as you mentioned, I think there's frankly, a perception crisis on this idea of quality of hire, and people have quit on it. And yet it seems like so simplistic of a thing to go fix, right? Our human capital is our greatest investment that we make, and yet for some reason we don't hold it to the same ROI thresholds that we hold every other piece of our business,
Yeah,
right?
no, I
So
agree.
that's what we're trying to fix.
I've often said, the most important decision we ever make about employees is the decision to hire them. But it's amazing how little rigor is put on, or even more, seeing if it was the right decision we made. So, talk a little more about what the technology you're building actually does, because there's the two sides of it. There's the reference side, to make sure that before you hire them, and then there's the after hire them. So, tell us a little bit about what actually are you building?
Yeah, and I to understand that in terms of our product journey, and I don't, we started thinking we could help solve the selection part of the process, right? And so we built a product that's the CrossCheck 360, which effectively is like what you'd expect in a 360 performance review of a existing hire, but done pre-hire, right? So surveys go out to the candidate, and then surveys also go out to their former coworkers, hiring managers, peers, and all that data comes back and is aggregated and shows you how well matched they are to the job, to the culture of the company, soft skills, hard skills, all that good stuff. That was kind of our flagship product that we initially launched. And it's a great product. It's number one in the market for solving that business challenge. But the reality is, as we got into it, and as you can imagine, you're starting to go into companies. You're like, hey, you're using this great product, and we want to show efficacy of the product, and we want to show that we're improving your quality of hire. And they look at you with three eyes, like, well, how do you can even prove that? And that was one of the unlocks for us. We're like, oh my gosh, we're I think it's the Michael Porter quote, right? If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And we're like, we're trying to solve a problem that no one is even measuring. So how are we ever going to fix it? Right? And
Yeah.
so that was the unlock where we said, okay, we got to go help build a really easy to use platform that enables the enterprise to begin to measure, benchmark, and ultimately operationalize this concept of quality of hire. Right. And that's really kind of where we put the majority of our efforts today.
That's, it's funny. It's this classic example of the integrate thing where you're like saying we need to integrate our solution with the problem that we're solving, but people don't even know how to measure the problem.
Yeah, that's a
So
good point.
it's kind of it's funny how you back into that, sort of like, well, these people just knew they had a problem, so they bought your solution, and then you said, hey, we want to show you're solving the problem. They're like, well, we don't actually know. We just think we have a problem.
That's
So
it. It's the
that's really
truth. And
funny.
God bless. Look, and I'm not one to. It's the world we're all in, and we've set our talent acquisition, leaders up and our recruiters up with this butts and seats mentality and fill roles
Mhm.
quickly. Those are their KPIs. That's how they're paid. This is nobody's fault, right? Just to be really,
Mhm.
really clear, it's just a symptom of, right, the habits that we have created because we've for whatever reason put this wall up between right, the hiring side of the house and the other side of
Well,
the house.
I
So
I don't know. Counterpoint is it is someone's fault because for whatever reason they're not willing to incentivize people for the things that actually connect with downstream effects. So like And in fact, again, I talk about unforced errors on the show a couple times, but like to have your recruiters be compensated on butts in seats, or time to close, or how many candidates interviewed and how many hires made, is such a half measure that it ends up oftentimes being detrimental. W- do you agree with that? Because I don't. If you don't agree, then you're an expert, so I want to know why. What's up? And then also, and how to change my mind. But if you agree with that, like, how do we change that
Yeah.
perspective, right?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I want to give more grace to all of us, right? In terms of the
Yeah,
blame. The word blame is
that's
I'm
fair. That's
sensitive to
fair.
the word blame, right? Because
That's fair.
and I think everybody wakes up trying to do their level best based on
Yeah.
the hand they're dealt. But look, when you start to do this and you start to get this data, some of the things that you realize are mind blowing. And I could go through
Mhm.
every step in the hiring process, and I could tell you that if you're connecting with outcomes, you're going to learn a way to do that step better. So let me take some easy ones. Let's forget about the recruiter for a second. Some
Sure.
easy ones like source. Like, we published a report recently on just aggregating data across all of our outcomes based upon quality of hire by source of hire. We could look at, you spent $10 million on Indeed versus you spent 5 on Zip versus you spent, choose another job board, right?
Yeah.
Versus for your knowledge workers, you spent this on LinkedIn. Your internal referral program did this, right, et cetera.
Mhm.
You go down the list. That is fascinating
Right.
stuff where you can really quickly see, right, oh gosh, I am like upside down on this spend, right?
Mhm.
And I got some work to do there. And you can literally answer these sort of process optimization questions across your entire hiring process and see some
Mhm.
really interesting unlocks early. Things like interview, like we do a lot of work around taking interview scores into the
Mhm.
platform. Who was on the interview team? We can actually tell you with a high level of precision, whose interview review actually matters and
Oh.
whose doesn't. We can correlate. I think so there's something like 87% of people doing interviews now do 3 or less interviews a year.
Oh.
Subsequently, and the reality check is you're like, oh gosh, they carry a bit. You use the baseball reference. That's a big bat to have in the
Right.
selection process for someone who really isn't qualified to be a real judge of talent, right? And so you can just go down the list of these things. We do a lot of work on looking what assessments the company is using. Like, we can actually show you some horrifying data here around pre-hire assessments that are not only really poor candidate experiences, and we all know how that whole thing, but they're literally telling you to hire your lowest decile performers. And I mean that factually. That's how far off they are. So and I bring that up just because things like that, where you can make immediate process improvements, improve your candidate experience,
Mm.
get bias out of your program, right? Save some dough on this piece of
Yep.
technology that you bought that someone somewhere fell in love with, but it's actually not accomplishing the goal. And so there's a lot of that stuff that you can do. And then you can get into your point on recruiter incentives, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, like, we believe that and hiring manager incentives. I think that's the side of that coin. What we hear in market quite a bit is recruiters like, hey, it's my obligation up to 90 days. There's this
Yeah.
arbitrary thing like up to 90 days. If it's a quick quit, I'll take the hit, right? But then it's there's also
If
when you
I
start,
hired someone that was so obviously a bad fit that
right,
they can't even make it through 3 months, you don't have to pay me for that.
it's
Okay.
kind of right.
Deal.
And you look at also especially in like sales orgs and enterprise sales, you look at who was on the real stuff, who was on the onboarding team, who did the training, right?
Yeah.
There's some real stuff.
Sure.
And then you look at who was the hiring manager, you're looking at, and all these things. And the bottom line is they almost can feel overwhelming because there's so much of it. But this is the thing. It's like you got to start just getting this stuff out in front of you so you can start reacting to it, right? And it's
Mhm.
not just the one thing. And I think that's what, when I talked about this perception crisis of quality of hire before, I think it's because people just get so overwhelmed, right, by all the things that can
Yeah.
input, the quality of hire, that they kind of get
Well,
stuck.
it's just funny because you have this data that should be central to everything, right? Which is, was
Right.
this a good hire? And I used to work in a company that built staffing technology. One of our taglines was, "What's so good about making a bad hire quickly?" Because we put a lot of
I like
focus
that.
on We
That's
actually were
great.
doing machine learning back, this is 2007. You know, we had massive data sets, but it was 2007 AI technology. So it just took forever, right? Good chunk. But the biggest challenge that we'd have is we'd go in and I managed the team that built the assessments. And we said, we want to validate these because I've built, to your point about Mike, about assessments. You know, these personality and ability assessments, they barely work. They work. It's kind of amazing they work. They present, you know, if done well, they predict about 10% of the variance in performance, which is significant. That's a huge financial benefit, but
Right.
it's 10%. You're not that far away from zero. And so we were always like, we want data. We want post-hire data. And when we were able to get data on sales or tenure, it was mainly hourly frontline jobs. We could like do some really cool stuff with it, but the hardest thing was just getting the data. And there's even in the field of IO psychology, there's a phrase that's called the criteria problem, which is the challenge of getting criteria on actual job performance. So how are you solving that criteria problem? What do you actually do to measure quality of hire?
Yeah. And so when we again, a couple things that have changed since you were leading the charge on this, right?
Yes,
And one of the
way back
things
in the dark ages.
that's changed is just the accessibility of data, right? So just as a blocking and tackling piece, right? It's just that fact is, we have integrations into most of the leading ATSs, HRISs, performance management systems, just source data, right? There's a lot of source data. We suck data in from Qualtrics as an example. If folks are using Qualtrics for pieces, we also have our own kind of listening tools and survey tools because some of this is really specialized to what we do. But getting data into our what we call our intelligence cloud, but getting data into our cloud and cleansing that data is, it's easier than it was 10 years ago, right? So like that's a piece of it. So I think that if we can level set that getting to the data is the thing, then the question really is what data are we actually utilizing in how we measure this concept of quality of hire? When you do like your Google search on it, it's going to tell you, yeah, it's take performance plus tenure divided by whatever, put it over whatever, and that's your score, right? And you're like, okay, well, first of all, it's more than that. And so we have in the platform itself, we kind of have 10 pre-built components that an organization can stack rank on their own and weight on their own based upon their own, right, perception of quality in their organization. Now, we also know that if it's a barista at Starbucks or a frontline worker, right, your weighting of, let's say tenure is going to be a lot greater, and probably punctuality, frankly, is going to be a lot greater than your culture impact or level of engagement or some of these other inputs, right? Or even performance, right? So we have to acknowledge that, and that's the way the system is built, is it enables the organization in phase one to to set their sort of settings in the machine to what they think best maps to their company and their jobs. Once time kicks in, this is where the machine learning does its thing, and this is the beauty of the world we're all in right now, where you can process mass amounts of data and have things get smarter and smarter and smarter and help inform, right, that you might have thought that X mattered, but it's actually that Y was a thing. I mean, we're even looking at, I know we're all talking about skills and competencies now. We're doing a lot of work right now around that. It's, hey, here's the skills and competencies that we put in the job requisition. Here's the skills and competencies that we went out and tried to assess in an assessment or in our interview. And here's the skills and competencies that actually ended up to be correlating to higher performance, right? And you just like, you have this unlock, you're like, oh gosh, right? We started this whole thing in the wrong place, right? In terms of how we even sourced talent and selected talent, and those aren't even the things that actually mattered, right? And it's so that's the idea though, is it's not, there's not one answer. Certainly tenure is an easy one, right? But there's a whole long list of other things. For some organizations now, diversity is an actual input into quality of hire, right? That'll be part of their model because for their organization, that's part of how they, right, view it, right? And so and that's the thing. You need to have it kind of adjust to whatever the company is and the role.
How much of this, if you're talking about the different data, how much of it is passively collected data? So like, tenure, for example, you could just get tenure feed from like their payroll system or something,
Yep.
or some companies would have sales data. You can get that, but then other times it's actually having managers rate performance. How does that break down? How much would you say when you do this? How much of it is data that's just fed passively from some system versus data that actually requires like a manager or someone to go in and do a rating?
Yeah, time matters on that continuum. So things that you're getting, that are more structured in that regard, you're getting things like you mentioned, like tenure. You're getting payroll. Did they get a raise? Right? Did they get a promotion? Right? You're getting some of that stuff from the existing system. The things that and why I mentioned earlier that we kind of had to roll out our own internal survey and listening capabilities was because people wanted data quicker,
Mhm.
especially on new hires. And in many organizations, if you think about a performance review, they weren't getting any indication of performance until it was probably too late, right? And it might be 12 months after you started where your first performance review came back. So it was way too challenging
Yeah.
to actually make a read. So we've rolled out a pretty robust set of, surveys that are going out 30, 60, 90, 180, and they're doing as much as could be as simple as would you rehire Mike? Like rehirability
Mhm.
is a keystone question that you can ask early,
Interesting.
right? That's not as
Mhm.
performance related. That is a really good input and a good signal, right? And it goes all the way. Those surveys can be more specific. They can literally get down to the skills and competency pieces. You could do that at 90 days. So it's a balancing act between, if we can't get, we would love, our preference would always be to get that data from your native systems and get it in a structured way, but more often than not, you don't have it. So often folks are using our cross-check, what we call cross-check voice, but our cross-check survey tool to help feed the machine earlier in the process.
Wow, that's so. Jordan, I'm going to ask the question that you don't really ask, which is, seems so obvious that every company should do this, but they don't, which makes me think that they don't spend money on it historically. How do you convince people to actually spend money on something that historically they've just ignored?
Well, clearly I'm not very good at selling it, or else they would all be using it. So I can take that on the chin. No, it's hard. It is, we're fighting this on two fronts, right? We're fighting on the front of behavior, there's the behavior change, but then there's also the culture change, right? And gosh, when the companies of ours that are uber successful with this, it's like at the C-suite. This has become a C-level metric. It's in their board decks. It's, they're no longer talking about, when they're reporting on talent acquisition at the board level, they're not talking about what was our, they're talking about what was our quality hire for the last
Mhm.
period, right? That's the right mentality. Like where this conversation gets awesome for folks like us is CFOs are asking the question. CFOs are wanting to understand, not only are we going to make our hiring goals, but are we going to make our hiring goals with folks that are going to have a high likelihood of performing well, and subsequently can I project the business out, right, based upon right that hiring cohort. So this, and I just bring this up because and I didn't answer your question actually, but the challenge on us is we've got to make sure we're solving specific business problems and finding champions in the organization that want that business problem solved, right? So like, and those can be different constituents. We have seen a lot of activity with buying centers with heads of sales. Fail rates with sales hiring is so high, right, that they're like looking for anything they can do to improve quality of hire. And in sales hiring, it's a direct correlation, right, to revenue productivity and to the business impact. So it becomes an interesting buying center, right?
I've been involved in this for a while now, similar type of sale, particularly when I was at Gallup. And, a lot of the pushback was around like, well, we don't have the data. But that was the year 2012, right?
Right.
Has it gotten much easier to get the data? Meaning, if we're evaluating the value chain all the way and combining it in parallel with the employee life cycle, all the way back to when a potential candidate touches a job posting, right? And considers applying. I assume it is, but I worry that the answer might not be what I want it to be, which is now it's way easier to understand performance data, retention data, to get access to, all the different types of uh, data elements that would provide us the opportunity to analyze the results, analyze the impact, and continue to measure utility over time. Has it gotten easier? And if not, if I can step on one of Steve's questions, like, what do you wish someone would build that would make it easier?
I mean, it's for sure gotten easier, right?
Thank God.
It absolutely has gotten easier, and just the general maturity of the ecosystem. I think the average TA department now has 12 different pieces of software.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Well,
Maybe we've
Wow.
over-indexed.
right? No, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that we surely have, but it has gotten easier to get the data into the machine. I really think this is this is about behavior change and culture shift, and this is about, a mentality shift, a fundamental mentality shift of, butts in seats quickly, right? To high quality butts in seats quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is kind of like the equivalent for health is when you go in and get on the scale and get your blood pressure measured and all these other things. You can think you're doing all the right things, but then the numbers don't lie, right? And it calls into sometimes, you don't want to know the answer because you're like, I don't want to change my behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
So I could see there being really almost resistance, certainly like on the recruiting side. A lot of recruiting is like, hey, we're making money just filling butts and seats. I don't want to have to focus quality of hire. Oh my God, that's going to be terrible. Or training programs are important. I could see this raising a lot of uncomfortable things. And on that point though, if you look at like all the stuff that you're doing in this area of like improving quality of hire, and this includes the other parts, the references and the checks, it's is there any sort of just like standard technology like, look, here's something that absolutely is easy to use, it's proven, I cannot believe everyone doesn't do this? What would that be? Whether it's just your solution or just in general that would have a big impact on this problem?
Gosh, I wish I had a better I mean, outside of our solution. Of course, I think our solution is the answer to that.
That's okay.
I don't know. It's not a silver bullet kind of problem. So I don't think it is. And so I think it is about getting, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. For the love of God, we got to start measuring it, right? We got to start tracking this thing. We got to and we talk about this kind of progress over perfection concept of like,
Mhm.
you just can't get out of your way because you're going to debate internally about how do I even measure it? What goes into quality of hire? You're going to have these 17 different excuses not to actually start to track this thing. Right. So I really do think it's whether it's us or your own people analytics team or somebody like getting away, just taking control of this concept and just really, really, really trying to, get your hands wrapped around, right? How do I just improve the success rate of our hires? And I'll say that the broader vision of why that's the right thing to do for the business is right for people. Like, I mean, we all know it, like for the candidate, for talent gets in a job that doesn't work out for them, right? It's not good for anybody, right? It's just the whole machine and cycle that we're on, like this hamster wheel that we're on, that we just keep. I think we've gotten, we all probably got a little pessimistic that it can even be fixed, and subsequently we just kind of go back to our old habits. And I think you gotta rip that Band-Aid off. So.
Yeah, and it's one that I think also to how we're going to fix it. Because I remember going back to, I used to work in this field. You find these companies, you start measuring like post-hire tenure, and like 40% of their employees were gone in like 30 days. There's zero value for anyone for somebody gone in 30 days. You're just flushing money down the toilet. But if you don't start measuring that, you can't figure out, well, maybe there's something about the people that stay that we could look at to start look at that data. I think that's a good point. There's something you can measure about quality of hire, whether it's tenure or just manager saying, would you hire them again 90 days, something that would move the needle and start that conversation.
And by the way, a few basis point improvements in a problem like this, they
Yeah.
go a long way. This is not one of those you have to like, you know what I mean? You don't have to cut it in half. You just, right? And we all live it every day. We all work and with teams, and we all want to win. We all want the same outcomes, but so it doesn't take a lot.
I think it's just this is bringing back all these flashbacks when I used to work in this world a lot closer to it, that the frustration of, look, for the cost of one good hire, you'd probably pay for the whole system.
Right.
Yeah. Every time.
It's crazy for people to focus on it. Well, what would you say are the work as you're getting into this? What are the innovations that you're like most excited about? Like, what are you when you're saying, okay, one is just get us to this baseline. We should be measuring this, and it's doable, and it's a lot easier, as you said, to do now than we used to. But what are like some things where you're looking at this saying, hey, not only can we just get to a baseline here, there's really cool stuff. What are you uncovering? What technologies are, you're like, wow, this is going to be really transformational. What are you excited about?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, and I think one thing that is happening that I think can't be overlooked, because as I mentioned earlier, this is about behavior change and culture change. There's a generation of talent leaders now, like yourselves too, like all of us, that have kind of, that are mature, technology savvy, have expectations, are forward looking. They're not, look, our HR departments are not that weird corner office buried in the, in the basement of the right. Like that's not where we're at. And so that's a really powerful thing, in my opinion, as part of the innovation, is the people and the talent leaders that are going to be asking harder questions, or looking for new challenges, are accustomed to having data availability. Like I think there's a real thing there that's going to help. That's one. But your specific question on kind of technology innovation, and Jordan, as you had mentioned, is access to data easier? Yeah, for sure, it's easier. The cost of that is, gosh, it's complicated to process these large amounts of data, right? That's just an absolute. And so, and I hate to be on the, on the treadmill of AI, but like that is a thing. Generative AI, there's just some wonderful things that can be done to help you process, right, and interpret data, right? How do you actually synthesize large amounts of data into insights that are actionable more easily? That's cool stuff, right? We're getting beyond the days of just charts on a page. Like nobody just wants to see a bunch of graphs, like that's not what we're after. What we want is, we want actionable insights and recommendations of what to go do with what those graphs are saying, right? The graphs might look cool in my one slide in my deck to my boss, but that's not what I really need. I really need you to help drive me towards the outcome. So I really do think that's the next wave. It's like, okay, the data's here, we've got the data, but how do we really get this into easily digestible, actionable insights that our talent leaders can put to work? And that fires me up. That's the part I think that will also help the unlock here of having this just be a number on a page to something I can do something about.
Nice.
That absolutely. It's just like we used to talk about closed loop validation was the term that we would use, and when we actually did neural network, artificial intelligence stuff. This is again 2007 technology, but I remember doing one study with, it was like retail salespeople, and we would measure different personality characteristics, and what you find is like interactions. Like it was a great example. You found like typically high performing salesperson was extroverted and they were agreeable. They would strike up conversations and they were nice. But the highest selling salespeople were highly socially extroverted and they weren't agreeable. They didn't want to be your friend. They wanted to sell you shoes.
My favorite one.
And you never would have. I say you never would have uncovered that without this sort of data, this like interaction. That
cool.
Statistically you can't find that easily without pretty sophisticated data. But I think that ability to understand what drives quality of hire at such a higher level is not just good for the company, it's also good as we get into a more scarcity labor market, because increasingly it's not just are we making good hires, it's also not making sure we're not selecting people out that could have been successful. Which
my favorite example of that is I worked for a medical device manufacturer, and their MO, unsupported by data, was former elite athletes, right? And they had these theories, and it was very successful company in its own right. So it was obviously at least partially right, or their products were amazing, or whatever, or they had great moats. But in actuality, when we looked at the data, the group that specifically outperformed by such a huge margin that it changed the entire strategy of the company for hiring were high school math teachers. Because if you can sell math to high schoolers, you can sell anything to anyone. But also that these medical device salespeople were they had to be in the procedure, in the surgeries, giving advice to surgeons who are like the highest ego of anyone else, and they had to be great at math, very analytical and confident, right? And so ultimately, right, the answer to, from my perspective, part of the question is, if you are wandering the jungle of recruiting alone with no compass, then you're just messing your own self up. Get yourself a compass. The data is more accessible than
said.
it's ever been,
Yeah.
right? And connect the dots between who you're hiring, how you're hiring them, and what the potential outcomes you care about are well beyond 90 days.
Yeah, I think
It's
so. Mike,
really
you
well
got to.
said.
We're
Yeah.
completely excited because you're solving this problem we've all been facing. But
Yes.
my next question though is, so as you're going down this, it's interesting too, as you come in to say you're not from HR technology background. Are there lessons learned you've had of like things that either you've done personally or you've seen in this space of quality of hire that were just, this doesn't work? Is there like failures or things that people have tried that we should not be doing in this, trying to solve this problem?
I don't know yet. Um, I brought up an example earlier about these assessments that we've identified that we
Mhm.
should not be doing, right?
Mhm.
Like, full stop, period, stop. But I think we're about to find out a bunch of things that we shouldn't be doing. I'll tell you something that is pretty fascinating for me as it relates to crosscheck and some of the work that we're doing. I met with Commissioner Sunderling last week, who is the head of the EEOC. I don't know if you guys follow him at all. He's awesome. He's a really innovative guy. He's all into AI, and he's looking hard, and especially at hiring. It's one of the use cases for civil liberties violations that the EEOC is focused on, right? And one of the things that he's so excited about that we're doing, we're actually almost acting as a oversight for these AI matching machines, right? And if you think about what's happening today, and the eightfolds, the Workday just bought Hired Score, all those guys that are in that world where they're effectively using artificial intelligence to match a job requisition, right, with a resume, and then stack rank your applicants to tell you who to go interview, right?
Mhm.
And some version of that. And he was expressing to me, he's like, look, I'm talking to all these guys. Not one of them can tell me how their algorithms are working, and not one of them can prove to me that their algorithms are not incorporating bias. They say it and they've got all these other things, but they're not actually capable of proving it. Like, I literally need to see that skill that you put in that job rec is absolutely required to do that job, period.
Mhm.
Right? And so I mentioned this to you earlier, we're doing a lot of work on that, where we're actually doing that correlation between what skills did Jordan have and how successful was he in the job, right? That math teacher, you're a great example, right? Versus that athlete. And so what were those skills and that kind of thing. So I actually think, I don't know yet, but I do think there's been a wave of buying of software. A lot of organizations have bought different software, AI driven for selection, DNI. I think there's a lot of stuff that's been bought that hasn't, right? We haven't necessarily been answered the question, did it solve the problem that we bought the software to solve? And I think you're going to see in a lot of cases that maybe it didn't, or maybe it didn't at the level that we had hoped that it would,
Well, you're raising too, because there used to be a lot of focus on adverse impact in the field of biopsychology. That's my background. It's kind of gone away in companies as we're looking at this. We'll talk about skills and be careful. If as a company you inherit the talent pool that's available in society, and in our society, distribution of skills is not equitable across demographic groups. I mean, that is a larger societal problem, but it's not a problem a company can solve when they're hiring people. So if you're hiring large amounts of people, for example, we need engineering skills, you will probably, if you're really measuring engineering skills, show at what would look like bias, because you're not going to get an equal representation of society. That's not the company's fault. That is society's fault for not making education equally distributed across all of society. But if you said, oh, we have bias, but you didn't have any measure to perform quality of hire, you're going to you get it's like, and I think people understand on adverse impact, the law is it has to be job relevant. Well, you show job relevant by showing it impacts quality of hire. you know, and otherwise you get the fact of saying, oh my gosh, we have adverse impact. It seems to be biased. Get rid of it. It's like, well, that may be the thing you're getting rid of actually could be really critical And I mean, I have to be really careful because it's, the issue here is that our society sadly is not equal in distribution of skills. That's the
Right.
problem. But as a company, you have to deal with the talent pool you're given. So that's really fascinating. I think with this AI stuff, you're raising if I was a company with this AI tool, I would be really pushing hard to say we show this tool works not by the fact that we hired people, but
Right.
the fact that people we hired were successful.
Trust me, that's where I'm like, all right, we got the head of the EEOC telling me that every company should be using us in order to make sure their AI is working. I was like, that's cool,
Wow,
right?
yeah, congratulations to you. That'll help you with
Great.
that
Yeah.
sales thing you were talking about earlier. What about wish lists? So as you can, what do you wish? What's technology that you wish was out there that would help you solve this problem? That you say, we're not going to build this, but I wish somebody else would, because it would help us achieve what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it's a I kind of zoom out on it. I mean, maybe we are part of the conversation we just had is maybe we are closer to being part of solving that. But I like, is anything working? And I mean it, in an honest, like, naked way, right? Like, is any of this stuff working? And how do we collectively know that we're helping build better company? The whole thing, what our North Star goals actually are, right? So I know we're going to be a part of that puzzle, but I also think even more broadly, right, with our expectations of human capital and how teams are built and how individuals are progressing, it's increasingly hard for me and gets cloudy for me, right, on
Mhm.
what winning is and how we ultimately get to a better place. I always pivot back to this 45%, fail rate, and like
Mhm.
it just stinks for everyone, and so there is but I don't know. I don't have a good one in terms of a thing outside of our world, but I do think more broadly, I'm pretty committed to trying to solve that problem. That's the problem
Mhm.
we set out to solve, you know? So,
Yeah. No, I think it's good. I think, as you're answering the question, one of the things that I've always focused on this is we don't do a good job showing the true value of people, which is not measured in HR systems. It's like, are they selling more or having more products? It's measured in other HR technology. And a lot of the metrics that you might use, like for quality of hire, aren't going to come from HR technology systems.
yeah,
They could come from sales systems,
yeah.
other solutions. So I think the more integration that we have with the other business operation systems, the easier it will be for you to do what you're trying to accomplish, which is showing how much of this is related to hiring. So, I got one last question, Jordan. Do you have any questions?
Nope. Let's do it.
Okay, well, I guess there's two questions here. First of all, Mike, as you're getting into this, so much of our ability to build HR technology, it's interesting. I'm glad that it's fun. I'm glad and a bit ashamed that somebody who wasn't from HR technology had to come in and solve, which is such an obvious problem to solve. But as you're looking at career guidance, as you're sort of like solving this problem, what guidance you give to like people that might say, "Wow, I want to get into the field of using technology to create better workforces and stuff like that." What is it? What advice would you give to somebody considering this as a field to go into?
Start by being a math teacher. We've learned that. uh,
Math to high schoolers, very difficult.
I have look, it's all part of the journey, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be a destination if you're wanting to get into the HR tech space. It can be part of a broader journey. And I think it's an incredibly important part of any journey. So I would do it earlier in my career than later if I were someone that was interested in it. And it can be a jumping off point for so many other things. I have a really close friend who happens to be one of your top performing sellers at SAP that I've tried to hire for years, but he was an ex recruiter for a bunch of years. And he's just one of the best salespeople, enterprise salespeople, because he can speak the language. He knows the TA space. He knows the technology landscape, and he's been a user and knows the pain points of the problem that folks have experienced, right? So I just bring that up because I think it's an incredible launching point to understand how companies actually run, and you can take it in a bunch of different directions. And, a good entry point, we all know recruiting is a good entry point into the HR journey, right? And even in the that's a good place to get started. And you said kind of what skills and experiences. I think all these things are interconnected. Recruiting is a lot like sales, right? So go get some sales experience, and then leverage that into your recruiting experience. We're doing a lot of work right now. Just one thing to note: CrossCheck has a whole project called Project 941, where we're focused on getting second chance hiring opportunities for folks and getting people back into the workforce. Quick segue in this, and I'll come back to why it's relevant. We named it 941. Clay Thompson's an investor of ours. He's a player on the Golden State Warriors. Clay was a 4-time NBA champion. He got hurt twice back to back and was out of work for 941 days before he came back, right? So anyway, we put this whole program together, committed to getting 941 people back to work every year. It's a combination of upskilling, reskilling, and all this cool stuff. And so one of the things we've been doing a lot of work on right now is with recruiters, because so many recruiters have gotten laid off in the last year, right? Especially in the tech set. And we've been doing mentorship with recruiters to help them realize, hey, they could go be great salespeople, right? And actually, and it's exciting to see where you're, a little slight twist. And we literally, the advice we've given them is, hey, what was a great technology you liked using as a recruiter? Go reach out to that company. I'm sure they're hiring for sales, because everyone is, right? You're a user of their product and an evangelist of their product, and go. So, and it's been working great. I bring that up because I think it's just a good, it's a good place to land and build a full career. It's also a good launching pad for, other types of careers that we can all go attack.
Yeah, well, I never thought about that. It's a good point. Come into the HR technology space, or you can come in different ways to take a lot of different directions. I also love the work that you're doing to bring people back in, which kind of goes back to the advantage of measuring quality of hire. Is I did research years ago where there was a company that found that some of the most successful people actually were people that had been justice involved. And it was, it's a long story about it, but it was like, by the traditional hiring criteria, they would not have been hired, but it was realizing, what actually drives performance. And it's kind of interesting. So I think that's a lot of that, getting people re-engaged, is challenging assumptions on what makes a good hire. And you can't know if those assumptions are right if you're not measuring whether or not they're good hires.
Right.
The very last question, what is a question that we should be asking about HR technology that we didn't talk about today? And the caveat is, we're also going to ask you to answer it.
That we didn't. Your catch on that is that we didn't ask today. And I don't want to. I come across as well. I do question whether we can break these human habits that we've created. I really do. I mean, I do. I lie awake at night and I ask myself that question, right? And my answer is, I freaking hope so. Right? But we are human, and this whole thing is human, and it's humans looking for jobs with humans, and it's all human, and that's why it's called human capital. Right? And so I think that is the question we always ask ourselves with all this stuff is, we can drive efficiencies and we can use software and technology to sort of do things faster and that sort of thing. Right? I think it's a real question for all of us is, can we, how much of this human problem can we solve? Right? And I hope we can. I hope we can move the needle, and I'm committed to trying. But that's what I think about.
Yeah, no, that's good. Challenges some of the basic assumptions and thinking differently. Well, thank you, Mike. I think the work you're doing on it is, again, why we did this show. So the story of you're doing, the problems you're solving, stuff you're doing is really cool. So thank you so much for appearing on Integrate or Die, and excited to see what you do going forward. It's pretty cool stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jordan. Talk to you.